Hit that now. There we go. So we should be recording now. So excellent. Welcome to the folks joining. This is Andy's discussion about job quality in small and growing businesses. So I'm Matthew Gutentag. I'm the Research and Impact Director with Andy. I think all the folks on the call know Andy, but if you don't, if you kind of saw this invite floating around, we're the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. So we're a membership organization of about 300 organizations that support small and growing businesses in developing economies. The reason we wanted to bring folks together today is because, oh, sorry, let me start with some quick housekeeping notes. As I mentioned, we are recording this. So we are going to post this to the Andy website afterwards. I think this is automatically done, but please, stay on mute at least at first while we're having the overall discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A as well. So if you do have any questions throughout the discussion, you can submit them either via the chat or once we get towards later in the call, you can hop off mute or hit the little hand raise button. I'll try to keep an eye out for that. This discussion is part of a series. It's actually the last in a series that we've been doing this week. That's been really great around different topics that we covered in a series of reports we released this week. It's the What We Know About reports. So these are essentially synthesizing the evidence on different issues that are important for supporting small and growing businesses. So these are issues that our members in the sector really cares about, and that we know there's a lot of academic and practitioner work on, but we didn't think it had all been kind of pulled together into one place. So the way we put it is we wanted to kind of do your homework for you, go spend a bunch of time reading all the literature out there and try to synthesize it into really bite-sized, quick takeaways. So we did 3 of these. The first one, well, they're not the first one, they all released at the same time, but one of them on talent management, which we had a great discussion on yesterday. Another on cultivating entrepreneurial ecosystems, which we had a discussion on Wednesday. And then this is our final discussion related to job quality within small and growing businesses. So why job quality? Well, Andy and our members for years ever since the launch of the SDGs, have been really interested in SDG 8 specifically, which is a focus on decent work and economic growth. And we found that there's been, a lot of, in the kind of small and growing business, private sector support world, there's a lot of focus on the economic growth piece and a lot of discussion of decent work, but not a lot of kind of unpacking and always getting into the nitty gritty of what that looks like. So we looked at the academic and practitioner literature, we pulled it together, and we're really excited to have some experts today to guide us in a discussion on, some of the key findings and the key topics that came out of that work. So I am going to move to introducing our experts. So we have, first of all, with us, Amalo Nguena, who is the CEO of BFA Global, a consulting firm that applies financial and digital innovation, venture building, and investment expertise to improve the resilience and well-being of underserved people. Formerly, before joining BFA Global, she was the managing director of Digital Divide Kenya, Digital Divide Data Kenya, excuse me, a social enterprise that provides data and research services to companies and governments while hiring young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and supporting their higher education. So she has kind of a practitioner's perspective, both as a consultant, but also having actually worked on hiring people and providing decent work herself. We also have with us today Steve Hartrick, who's a technical officer of inclusive markets and value chains with the International Labor Organization, or ILO. You may have heard of the ILO. They are to some degree the big actor when you talk about job quality in terms of setting standards and kind of managing the international system around it. Steve leads the Inclusive Markets and Value Chains team, which coordinates technical research and support for better sector selection, market systems analysis, monitoring and results measurement, and project implementation with an employment lens. He was the project coordinator for the Lab project, which is a research and knowledge generation project on how a systemic approach can create more and better jobs. And we reference both work from BFA Global and the ILO, a lot from the ILO in our report. So I encourage folks to check that out. So, you know, I really encourage everybody to look at the reports, but today I really want to turn it over quickly to our experts to dive into some of the findings. And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen now so that we can have a little more larger icons for everybody. So to start with, I'd love to turn it over to Steve to hear a little bit about your work with the ILO and the framework the ILO uses for thinking about job quality.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for everybody for joining and having me here today. It's nice to have a group that wants to talk about job quality. So yeah, what does the ILO consider in terms of job quality? For us, I guess job quality is grounded in decent work. And so to give you a little bit of background on what we consider decent work, it has 10 different components, and you know it's quite diverse. So and nested within decent work is job quality for us. So what is decent work? Well, the first component is, do you actually have a job? So are you employed? So that's one component. Then we have 7 components which kind of make up job quality, and that is about, are you making enough money? So are you productively employed? So are you making enough money relative to the input that you put in and what you need to live? Are there equal employment opportunities and treatment in the workplace? Another one on occupational safety and health, a safe working environment, and also on contract stability and combining work, home and life balance. And I think that is just about it on the job quality components. You can see lots of diverse components. There's also 2 other components which are part of decent work, which kind of, I guess, relate to how well the labor market is functioning. That's Social Security and social dialogue. So the engagement between trade unions and employer organizations to negotiate terms of workers, formal workers. So that's the big picture of decent work, and within it, job quality. So yeah, you can see it means a lot of different things. So that's basically the founding.
Excellent, thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's the ILO really is the central organization for providing these global frameworks, and we're going to move to unpacking a little bit more about what that looks like on the ground. But I wanted to turn it over to Amalo to tell us a little, to start with, about how BFA Global supports good jobs, and a bit more about how you thought about this issue when you were a digital entrepreneur yourself, kind of dealing with it hands-on.
Thanks, Matt. So BFA Global is implementing a number of projects that are aimed at helping micro entrepreneurs access digital commerce. So it's a particular subset of the world of jobs. And then my previous work at Digital Divide Data was helping young people who did not want to be entrepreneurs to build a career in the digital field by starting with remote data processing and supporting their higher education. So I think one of the things which we're facing in developing countries is that most people don't work in the formal sector. So, and not just most, but the huge majority, 85% in Africa, and nearly as high in the rest of the developing world, work in smallholder farming and informal sector work. So the choices and opportunities and trade-offs are not the same as if the main options are formal employment, as we see in Europe. And I think there's a huge tradition and literature in micro-enterprise development, but we do have to recognize that not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. Most people would actually prefer to be an employee if they can get that job that is decent and meets their needs in the local context.
Excellent. So I want to kind of keep going on that thread with you, Amalo, because with the literature, when we did this review, we found that a lot of the research and a lot of the frameworks out there were really focused on, especially larger businesses in higher income countries, and were really appropriate for them. So, as you mentioned, both in the informal sector and even kind of small formalized businesses in developing economies, things might look a little bit different. The realities the ability to create work that meets certain standards might not be there. So in your experience, how would one need to adapt or change or shift thinking about, what constitutes a quality job to fit that setting in that context?
I think what people want out of their job is not so different in the informal sector. I mean, to be honest, things like pension and unemployment insurance, which are provided or provided for by the government, those are out of reach or out of dreaming reach in the informal sector, micro enterprise, and even small enterprise. But the things that people would like, which is reliable understanding of what their job is supposed to be, reasonable hours of work, respectful treatment, decent pay, that sort of set of basic criteria is what people also want in the informal sector, and to a great extent, I think, are provided, because if you don't do that, then you can't have workers. There obviously the problem is that there's no enforcement for abuses, and of course there are no greater social safety net for the day when you're no longer in employment, and there's no safety net for the health crisis. So I think what we see is that there's that question of reliability is also a problem on the employer side, that both people have trouble identifying, and then the incentives to conform to being reliable and dependable to your employee and to your employer are weaker. And so there's a constant kind of ongoing frustration between the worker who says, I can't get a decent employer, and the employer who says, I can't get reliable employees. So overall, obviously, the lack of government structure and enforcement mechanism means that informal sector work is less supported and less decent, but at the same time, you do have to treat your employees with a certain level of reliability. Otherwise, even in the informal sector, you will not be able to get them.
Absolutely. So yeah, I want to come back to the incentives and the capacity issue in a minute, but I want to go over to Steve to talk a little bit about something Amalo touched on about everybody wants the same thing, but it can be harder to maybe achieve that, and then it can be the starting point is different, very, very different for small businesses in developing economies. So the ILO is the one who creates these standards largely, and tries to measure them and tries to actually have people follow them. How does the ILO, or how do you adapt those, if at all, when you're going in and working with these employers who may be informal, semi-formal, those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think sometimes the ILO really struggles with that. So I would just say I'm speaking on my personal capacity here and not on behalf of the ILO. But yeah, I mean, okay, so the idea of the ILO sets out what's ideal in terms of these different elements of decent work and what we want. And a lot of times what they set out in terms of how to measure them are these macro level indicators for each one of those components, which could be, labor participation rate, or percentage of children working in wage work. And these are not really helpful for most entrepreneurs, So the indicators that are formalized by the ILO and for measurement of these decent work areas, job quality areas, aren't useful for most of us, and aren't really useful for, say, if you're negotiating with employers associations or trade unions. So I think one thing that I guess my team, what we like to do is, so we have these large frameworks, and so we don't necessarily think that they're useful. But what we try to do is, I guess what Amala was saying is really look at what's meaningful to the worker and to the enterprise to some extent. And we really try to see what's achievable from a project or from an investment perspective in terms of, okay, I am sitting in Geneva with a very good quality job here, but most people working in micro and small businesses are not. And so will they actually graduate to a good quality job through our work or investment? Probably not. No, there's just too much to really change, and it's unrealistic for a project to really address all these different components. So what we like to do is look at maybe what's most concerning for the worker and what's most feasible to address as well. And so we try to make kind of a marginal improvement in the job quality. So what we try to do is reframe from creating a lot of like the impact indicators that our projects have are creating decent jobs. That's what is linked to SDG 8, as you said earlier, Matt. But what we try to do is reframe that and say that I think that creating a decent job is probably a little unrealistic for a lot of these projects. So what we try to do is frame that into improving job quality or number of jobs to improve. So as the main message is zeroing in on what's important and what's feasible to improve, and then really trying to make a marginal difference. And we feel like if you make that marginal difference, then you can put these workers on a pathway to a good quality job or decent work. So yeah, I guess in that light, then it's quite contextual in terms of what is important to workers or businesses.
When you are trying to see if that's happened, how do you measure that? When we were talking the other day in advance of this call, we were talking about how there are these, and in the report we discussed there's objective dimensions of job quality and subjective dimensions, and they have different challenges there. So in your experience, when you are going in and trying to intervene there and change things, how, when you go back a year, 2 years, 3 years later, what are you looking at to see if change happened?
Yeah, well, it's to be honest, it's something that's been underexplored in the ILO. Yeah, so what we try to do is, well, first of all, when I was working when I am working in a lot of projects, a lot of people used to ask me and still ask me, what is a decent job or what is a good quality job? I guess similar to the discussion we're having, and how do we measure it? And I didn't really have an answer because I didn't know how, and I didn't have really good guidance from the ILO. And so then we realized that this was a serious issue. Me and the team that I work with, we basically tried to aggregate a series of measurement indicators from sustainability standards, from ILO projects or projects that looked at decent work, from sort of compliance criteria and this type of thing, and aggregated them all together and put them out there and try to get people to measure decent work by having these indicators. So it was basically like 300 indicators that you could choose from, which may or may not be applicable to whatever project you're working for, but at least you have something. But that really wasn't enough for people because they needed to know how, and so this gets back to your question about what's the process of doing that. So again, it's zeroing in on the elements of decent work that you think, or job quality that you think are most important, that you can actually move the kind of the marker on, setting, identifying what indicators you think would be valuable to measure in those areas of job quality, and then tracking that over time. Now, will that process tell you if you have improved a job or not? It's not so clear. No, I mean, it's if a company has put in a few new safety policies in place, does that constitute better jobs for all the workers? It's up for the project to decide. So it's not necessarily something so quantifiable. Now, in terms of these subjective things, so that we've just tried to quantify the sort of job quality hard components, but sort of the more subjective stuff is something we've not tackled yet. And so, if there are people that have ideas on that, we'd definitely like to hear from you today.
Absolutely. I'm curious your perspective on this. When you've been, as both an advisor and an entrepreneur, what are the measures and indicators or markers that you're looking for that would tell you that, yes, these jobs that are created are good or are getting better?
Yeah, I think it is very hard to measure, and I think in our work and also in my kind of personal outlook, there are two big measures, that one's subjective and one's objective, that I think simplify things, at least for me. And one is just income and income growth. And I think in most of our developing countries, the average person's income is just not sufficient to meet reasonable daily needs. And if that income can have a growth trajectory, then that job is getting better. And then the other thing is, are they willing to stay in the job? And I think in some of the ILO surveys, this is a question: do you still want to be doing the same thing in 6 months' time? And I think, that doesn't make it a great and wonderful job, but it would seem good enough if people think they'd like to still be in it in 6 months. So I think those are things that I really focus on. I agree, and I think everybody should have pensions, for example, but at a basic level, we're struggling with unemployment and underemployment and jobs that are so far from meeting all the necessary requirements, that I think those two, for me, represent the core of the question.
Great. That's really helpful to kind of get to a couple specific things out of this universe of possibilities. But I wanted to go back to something that came up a little bit earlier in the introductions around the employers and the entrepreneurs themselves, and there's that side of things, right? So we've mentioned a few things that the workers would presumably want, and how to measure that. But on the entrepreneur side, I mean, they're the ones creating the jobs. They're the ones who are kind of facing various sorts of constraints and considering the trade-offs that might be involved in adding new benefits, increasing salaries, adding new human resource support, those sorts of things. So for I guess this would be for either of you, in your experience talking to employers, working with employers, any thoughts on their perspective and the sorts of arguments or the sorts of approaches that tend to appeal to them and tend to actually get them to change their practices?
I guess I'll start at the very bottom of the micro enterprise or the smallholder farmer. And basically, they're not that different in terms of their income or assets or abilities as the person they're employing. So what we do see is that people want to minimize what they're paying, and they want to not have, well, I was going to say they want to have not long-term obligations, but on the other hand, they really struggle with this problem of having reliable employees. So they are willing to pay more when they can confirm that somebody is honest and dependable and reliable. But they're all in the same low productivity trap. And I don't think telling people to change their ways is really possible at that level. It's more that the enterprise or the activity has to have a little more productivity, which is a little more give in the system. And then they can potentially, and I think often they will work with somebody who's unproductive, but who's reliable and honest, rather than taking the risk of somebody who's going to steal their business or who won't show up. So how the employer sees a good employee is not necessarily economically most efficient. So I think aiming at that productivity in these micro enterprises is the only way to have a little more income for everybody, which then can translate into various types of better working conditions for these very low wage informal sector workers.
Just add just quickly here, no, basically the same thing, but yeah, I mean, there needs to be an incentive for them to do it, you know, so there needs to be a business case, or it needs to make business sense, and you know, for a lot of the job quality components that we've been talking about, there often isn't the business case for that, you know, so then it's where do we focus? So what we need is, you know, as you said, we really need to look at, you know, better productivity and what can improve productivity. Well, there's like, you know, if you pay your workers better, you might get better workers, more reliable workers that then can produce more, which then that can have an economic benefit to your business. I mean, occupational safety and health is the other one. I mean, if your workers are missing, there's absenteeism. And we had a project in India where there's tea plantation and there's huge amounts of absenteeism because workers are always sick. And so, you know, we made a case for clean toilets, sort of a bit more hygienic practices, clean lunch, and you know, that's like a powerful case. That doesn't cost very much, and it can improve the productivity and well-being of the workers at the same time. Right now in Ethiopia, there's really, you know, looking at agro-processors that are really high turnover, high absenteeism, and they have to train, invest quite a lot in training these workers. And so, you know, you train them, you spend 6 months, and then they leave after another 6 months. It's not very good for your business as well. So we're looking at, okay, what's the cost of this turnover to your business? And what are the reasons people leaving? And then sort of presenting that, like, okay, what can you do to address these reasons? And so what's that cost to you, and what kind of benefit can it derive from your business? So, I mean, basically businesses listen to this, this business case. The other thing is, if I can just say one more thing, is that, you know, a lot of times, particularly, well, businesses may not be aware of what, you know, good job quality is. It's like, you know, you're working in construction sector, and everybody is, you know, nobody's wearing sort of the protective gear, there are no prevention measures. It's not because the employer doesn't want their workers to be safe. It's just, that's just how construction is done in this country. So they've got no reference point for what's better. And so I think sometimes awareness of some of these issues can play a nice a role to kind of motivate them to change the way that they, or the conditions.
Great, and I think we've got a question that I think is a follow-up a little bit there, which is, what would the advice be to entrepreneur support organizations on how to support entrepreneurs to improve job quality in their startups? So looking at the intervention, you referenced there, Steve, a little bit about you know, the messaging that works, but like what are the actual interventions is it that one might design if you are going in and saying, I'm going to get this group of entrepreneurs and I'm going to help them as they create jobs, make sure they hit the standards. And that would be for either of you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on, yeah, I mean, this is always the answer in any development, but it depends on, you know, context or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I guess, so, yeah, I would say, I mean, I think the advice to us is to look to find where you see some low levels of productivity or something that's affecting productivity, or a way that's actually affecting negatively to their business. And then once you kind of can have some understanding of what that is, and then try to link that to how to job quality, and then say, okay, again, this is what's these are the what we see from a productivity perspective is quite low, or could be improved, or where you're losing on your business, and this is one of the reasons or causes to that. And if you can invest in your workers or invest in this way, it can address that issue. So yeah, it's not being very, I would say, you know, one thing we did in, and this is for, you know, larger plantations in the Dominican Republic, was that we showed that there were huge losses on their banana plantations that were losing like 20% of their profit, and it was just because the workers, they said, didn't care. And so we looked at ways that they could sort of what were the motivations for their workers, what made them happy, and what could they do to invest in them for them to kind of take more care of what they were doing and produce more. And then also, yeah, there was a component if they produced more and there was less waste, that would actually bring more money into their pockets. And so communicating that message to those workers was also another thing, in terms of workers weren't aware that if they produced more, that they would actually receive more. And so that was another kind of concrete thing that we tried to do with some of these plantations. So
that's great. So rather than starting with the sort of like, here's what a good job is, here's what the framework is, you start with the business and their, some productivity issue, and then figure out how, the improvement in job quality can address that. That's a really interesting way to think about it. Amala, from your, you've advised governments and companies. From your perspective, what has been what approaches have you taken in terms of designing interventions there?
I think when we're talking about startups, there's a point about the instability of the startup and new company that feeds into a lot of strange and often unfair treatment of workers, including not paying wages at required amounts, or if the business suddenly goes out of business, and so on. And I think one of the things that just relating especially to new entrepreneurs is they often have their background is in something different. I mean, we work with a lot of digital entrepreneurs whose background is in technology, and I'm sure it applies in other sectors that you start, your business because you like some technical aspect and not because you have knowledge in hiring, managing people. And so I think one of the things for entrepreneurs is some training and advice on what the legal requirements are on the one hand, because basically I think when you talk about startups, you're talking about formal enterprises, but also on hiring and management, so that there's more of a chance of their hiring, thinking about how they're hiring and managing people in a more professional way. And then hopefully that both benefits the business and allows the people who do work for it to have, a predictable and more stable work journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the theme, I think the common theme there is starting with the specifics of a given business or a given sector, and what the needs are there, rather than coming in with this framework and saying this is one size fits all. You just have to do this, and instead looking at where the benefits are to the businesses. In the discussion of digital entrepreneurs, actually, I want to continue on that a little bit, because a lot of what I've seen, the discussion of job quality has started to mix in with the discussions on kind of the future of work, and in particular the gig economy. That's a huge topic in the US and Europe, with the rise of various platforms to allow for part-time more work. That it looks a little bit more like informal work, actually. But this is also growing a lot in developing economies. That's a very different context and a very different labor market in which these gig platforms, these gig jobs are entering. And I know BFA Global has written about this. We cited a few articles from you there. So I'm curious, Amalo, from your perspective, how you think about the rise of the gig economy in terms of the prospects for decent work in the future in these contexts.
Yeah, so I think the starting point is so different. The starting point is where most jobs are in the informal economy. They're very unproductive. Wages are low, and working conditions are poor. And so for most people, the gig job is better. Doesn't make it great, but it's better. And it's both better because of the flexibility and kind of a little bit more control over your life than if you're in employment, and because the the pay is more dependable at the very least, and perhaps a little higher. And so it's a transition zone anyway between the informal sector and the formal sector. And people are moving out of the informal sector and into those gig jobs, largely. Obviously, there's some that go the other direction, but generally, they're better jobs than the other option. And they're creeping towards formalization. They're becoming more visible to, well, the tax authority on the one hand, but also the social security system or the national health insurance program. So I think there's a challenge for how to regulate and manage, because obviously we all know that the platform has this giant buyer power in that market, and they easily push down wages. But at the same time, they do provide opportunities that were not there before and that are better, and also have that kind of step into formalization. We're going to see whether people who go through gig work platforms then become more formalized, either employees or even employers, if they save up money and then they start their own businesses. But I think we need to be careful not to try and turn that into the same as formal sector work, which is really not an option for most people.
I like that phrase, creeping towards formalization. I think that's a really good way to put it. And so just to know, we've got about 5 minutes left. So if anyone does have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I have a couple more, but always want to prioritize questions from participants. But Steve, in terms of the ILO, you know, how do in your work, how do you think about the rise of these new types of jobs, in particular in the context of developing economies, and how they fit into how you think about decent work?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just to highlight slightly different what Amola is saying is that, yeah, or what she's been saying the whole time is that, you know, for most workers in the developing context, okay, so yeah, we can think about all the great things about decent work and job quality and what's a quality job, but I mean, pretty much most workers, it's about being paid, you know, and being paid to survive. So, you know, if you're getting paid more or more reliably, then that's like, you don't really care so much about the occupational safety and health. You don't care about, I mean, Social Security is something that's like, you know, would be nice, but it's not something that you really expect right now. So yeah, if it improves the income and the reliability of the income, then that's an improvement of the job quality, which is, again, you know, you talk about this creeping like that, or this pathway, which towards yeah, sort of decent work or better quality jobs. So.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a super interesting topic, and one I'm sure we'll be hearing lots more about in the coming years. And I'm fascinated by how different the discussion is when you're talking about the rise of these platforms in the US and Europe, and then the rise of them in developing economies, where, as Amal was saying, they're just entering a totally different labor market context. So the issues are totally different. You know, so that's sort of the digital economy part. I do want to, just before we end, you know, we've talked a lot about how, you know, everything depends on the specifics of the business and the context. So I want to get any further thoughts on major sector differences in specific sectors you've worked on, in particular, you know, maybe outside of the digital piece. Are there major sectors where there's particular room for intervention and improvement among, you know, growing businesses that are going to make up a lot of employers in the future, where this job quality message and intervention is particularly important?
I guess I would say agriculture, and that's small scale agriculture. I think Steve has talked about larger commercial agriculture, but agriculture is a huge employer even in the informal sector. Not all smallholder farmers are not self-reliant. They usually both hire people to work on their own farm and they work on other people's farms. And I think And it's very low paid, difficult, unsafe work. In our research, I'm not sure that we didn't see many cases of people not receiving their wages in our research on smallholder farmers. I think that they're people in the community and they're usually paid, but there are huge opportunities to improve the quality of small scale agricultural labor. And again, some of it has got to be determined by productivity improvements in agriculture itself. So I'm not sure that there's an immediate thing that must be done beyond the traditional or ongoing efforts to improve the productivity of small scale agriculture.
Maybe if I can just highlight just maybe how different decent work is, the outlook of job quality in different sectors. So you have construction sector where in some countries like Rwanda, it's 99% informal workers. Jobs are not well paid, really poorly paid. But the sector of the highest risk of occupational injury or death. Yeah, and a lot of, actually the big issue for most of those workers is just being paid on time, because contractors would service other commitments before they pay their workers. So, anyway, huge job quality issues there. Now, they're not always so easy to address, but, and particularly at a very small scale, which is again, where the issues are. And just because, larger businesses are generally within the realm of enforcement by government, which is, really where, for a lot of things in job quality, as I said, there's no business case for it. So the role of government enforcement is quite important. But obviously, in developing contexts, that role of enforcement, particularly for smaller businesses, is really non-existent. So how you can do that in construction, I don't know, but I'm just highlighting. So also in say garments, for example, really the issue, although you could be working in a nice small business with the regular pay, etc., you might be working 60, 70 hours a week, and that's maybe an opportunity. So and also with kind of this business process outsourcing, for example, maybe it's something as similar as having regular contracts, regular pay, contract stability. So each sector has quite different outlook, and particularly, the point of the sector that you look at too. If you're, there are various parts in the value chain where the issues with job quality are completely different. So I'm not answering your question about where the opportunities are, but maybe just highlighting that, you'll find a challenge everywhere. So, but yeah, obviously agriculture, huge issues there that are pretty well documented.
Absolutely. Yeah. Agriculture, construction, those seem like areas, just, massive employers, tons of informal work, the sorts of places where huge opportunity for improvement. So this has been great. We are about at time. Before we sign off, I do want to just give a chance for any closing thoughts on anything, I've missed in the questioning that you think are really important insights or topics for people to keep in mind. A lot of our members support entrepreneurs, a lot of them are donors. Things that they need to think about as they consider decent work and job quality. So Amala, over to you for any last thoughts.
I guess my thought is really about that hopeful expected transition from the micro enterprise to a world in which there are more of maybe small businesses that are more formal. And I don't think we really know how to manage that transition. Usually what you have are unregulated informal businesses, and then you have this giant step where the company now has to conform with 20 different rules and standards. And we need to find a way to make that a slope so that as you get a little bit bigger, you hire your first part-time employee, maybe you have one little thing you're supposed to do, and that increases slowly and encourages people to move up the slope, because that huge step scares and blocks people. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we know the answer, but I think we need to work on how we make that into a smoother path for businesses that want to at least grow a little bit bigger than they are.
That's really, I feel like one theme has come up a number of times on this discussion is this need for, incremental sort of look at change over a spectrum rather than this kind of, you have jobs that have no protections, nothing, and then you have, 100 different points you have to hit. And there's a lot in between, and moving people along that is really important. So that's really helpful. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, one last thing. Okay, so if you're struggling with job quality, that's okay because everybody is. So that's an important thing. But I would just say my key takeaway is, yeah, really try to understand the context of what you operate in, really try to understand the different components of job quality and what you think that you can most meaningfully change for both the worker and in terms of a feasibility perspective of the project, and try to drive for that to get on this pathway or creeping, as you say. So yeah, try not, it can get endlessly complicated, but try to keep it as simple as possible and understand it.
Perfect. Well, with that, thank you so much to both of you for joining. I think that was a great discussion. I even having read all the papers, I learned a lot just in the discussion. It's always helpful to talk it through. As I mentioned, I saw a comment. We will be posting this, so we'll make sure to have that on the Andy site. So please do check that out if you want to reference this. And have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.